Greetings, global gardeners. Yes, it's that time again. Let's get together and talk gardening. Get our gardening week all set up, ready to go with some great camaraderie, some great gardening discussion, and of course, answers to your gardening questions. Can you feel it? The seasons are changing. For many of us, it's springtime and the weather's getting warmer. We're getting outside. We're getting closer to having the garden of our summer dreams. And for others of us, it's fall. Things are changing as well. Maybe getting a little bit cooler, but the garden is still alive. A lot of discussion today will be suitable for both. I want to talk about some of the things you can do in spring to get your garden going, some of the activities that you can take advantage of. Remember what we talk about today, because a lot of this discussion is also appropriate for fall in the garden. The plants are at completely different stages of their lives, but the activities that we do as gardeners can really make a difference when we focus on the spring preparation and the fall preparation. So by all means, throw out all your questions. Great to see everybody here. I want to go ahead and start with this comment because I think it's perfect for talking about one of the things you can do in spring and then again in fall. And it comes from Christine's Stress Reliever. Good morning to you. She says, I thought I would share that I got to see the Cincinnati Zoo this weekend. We drove 5 hours from Chicago to see Fiona the hippo and the botanical gardens. And I talked about this in recent weeks about making a trip to a botanical garden, actually making it a goal, an activity to make it something special. So I'm so glad that you did this because it is one of those fantastic things. She follows up by saying it was a wonderful weekend. It was the last weekend of all the tulips. Beautiful. And so springtime can be a great opportunity for these kind of things, making a weekend trip to a botanical garden, to a city garden, to a zoo. A lot of the zoos nowadays that I've gone to, I went to the New Orleans Zoo last year, and they've got sections of the zoo that are set aside specifically to highlight the plants that they're growing to match the animals that might be in the zoo. So I think it's a great idea. I'm so glad that you were able to make that trip. And so think about it. Get out as the weather is warming, or maybe after the peak of summer and it's beginning to cool in fall. This is such a great time to get out and explore gardens that you haven't been to before, maybe some of your favorite gardens, but take this opportunity to get out. I love going to botanical gardens in different cities because it always gives me new ideas for plants to grow, ideas for different types of beds, ideas for developing the hardscape in my garden, and some of those garden scenery points that you might want to design, and also some of the cool little knick-knacky things that you might just hide amongst your beds. You can get a lot of ideas like that from those bigger gardens. So I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to do that. And that's the opportunity that I'm going to be taking over the next couple of weeks. I've mentioned recently that I'm going to be taking a trip to the UK tomorrow. And I'm going to be visiting as many castle gardens and botanical gardens and YouTube gardener gardens. I'm going to be making this trip with gardening as the primary focus. This trip has been a few years in the making, and now it's here. And I'm excited because I know I'm going to learn new things. I'm going to see new things, and I'm going to be able to bring all that back to my garden to continue as I build and continue as I plant. And it all starts in a place that you may not even be aware of yet. But when you go and you see it, you'll know it. And that'll be one of those wonderful things that you can put into your garden. So look for those kind of things as we get into the spring. And Jana says, I just had a picnic with gardening friends at the UC Berkeley Botanical Garden. Azaleas and cactus blooms were spectacular. Yeah, exactly. If you can go with somebody, oh, it's even better, because you can talk about it, especially if it's another gardener that you can go with. Shandy's Garden says, I work for Macy's, and those tulips at the Cincinnati Zoo are incredible. We help plant those tulips every year. Cool. I think that's a great benefit of your job, and especially springtime, being able to get out and plant so others can enjoy it. That just is so exciting to me. So I'm so glad to hear that. That's fantastic. So start thinking about that. If it's not on your radar yet, start looking around at what options you have. I am an easy drive away from the Denver Botanical Garden. When I go see my brother down in Arizona, I like to stop in Phoenix at the Desert Garden there. When I go to San Diego, I went to San Diego over the holidays at the end of last year. I went to the San Diego Botanic Gardens for, I don't know, I think I've been 4 or 5 times in San Diego. So I love doing that. And even when you go to the same place again, you're going to see something new, and it's still going to be fresh and exciting. George Edgerod is saying, we have many long needles from what I think is a ponderosa pine. Will that compost? Yes, it will, George. The thing about pine needles, and ponderosa pines are very long, and that's one of the ways to differentiate them from other pine needles. The resins that are in the pine needles slow down the decomposition. So they will compost, but it will take a long time, and it may take a couple rounds of composting. So what I've done in the past, for instance, is I've composted pine needles, and when the compost is finished, I'll sift out the compost, and there's almost always some of the pine needles that are left behind, because it does take extra time for them to decompose and break down. So they're a great brown, a great carbon material to put into your compost pile. It's a great way to use the pine needles. If you have a lot of pine needles, one of the ways that I find actually helps them decompose maybe a little bit faster is to just make a big pile of pine needles. And so I had a garden a while back with huge ponderosa pine trees, and I would rake up piles 10 feet tall of the pine needles. Well, if you put a pile that's at least 4 feet by 4 feet, 6 feet by 6 feet is better, and wet it and keep it wet, the weight and the heat of that decomposition that builds up is going to actually break down the needles within that pile. And it's one of those really fun things in gardening that I like, is you have this big pile of pine needles, and I do the same thing with leaves, and I do the same thing with wood chips. You put it into a big pile, and now the fungal network takes over, in addition to the bacterial network that is in place as part of normal decomposition. And so when you throw in the bacteria and the fungi, it really speeds up the breakdown. And so you can start with a pile that's 5 feet tall, and within a few weeks, you'll notice that it is maybe 4 feet tall. And a few weeks later, it might be 3 feet tall. It still looks like a pile. I just let the pile sit. I don't turn it. I just let it sit. But after a few months, when you go to that pile and you move away those outer pine needles, the inside is going to be a beautiful dark brown. It's going to be breaking down, and at the bottom and in the interior of the pile, you may have finished compost in just a few months by having a pile like that. And that tends to happen a little bit faster than when you add it to a typical general type of compost pile. So absolutely take advantage of that. Laura says, I discovered a small botanical garden in Steamboat Springs on my honeymoon. I bought a peony tuber, but planted it way late, so I was afraid too late. It popped up last year. Oh, cool. So yeah, I love Steamboat Springs. I haven't been to Steamboat Springs in a couple of years. I know that there's the garden to the north of Steamboat Springs, if that's what you're talking about. They have like a bridge, and they have some streams and a little lake area. Yeah, absolutely beautiful. I typically go in autumn when we go to Steamboat Springs. that's one of those things where the when I've gone, it's been beautiful, but it's been kind of chilly. But still, fall, spring, the shoulder seasons, you beat the crowds, you can see the plants in a completely different view. I love that idea. I love that idea. Shawnee says sometimes it feels like there's too much to do in the spring. Yeah, so that's actually the idea behind why I wanted to talk about this today, because spring can be overwhelming. There is so much to do, and I'm already behind with the things that I want to do, partly because of the weather not cooperating with me, partly because I'm preparing for the trip. There's lots of reasons why we get behind. It's often because there's just so much to do. So let's break it down to some of the more important activities that you might want to focus on in spring when you're not sure just exactly what it is that you should be starting with. Now, soil is key. You've heard me say this many, many times. So the soil should be your primary focus. And this holds true throughout the year. But before the plants are growing, you really need to look at your soil. Now, I prefer to amend my beds in fall so that I have all winter and early spring for all that organic matter to incorporate into the soil so that the nutrients are available when I put the plants into my beds. That doesn't always work out. It doesn't always work out for me, even though that's part of my plan. It doesn't work out for a lot of gardeners. So if you weren't able to amend your beds in fall and you know your beds need to be amended, springtime is when you do it as early as possible, because you want to give those soil microbes the time to break down the organic matter. Just because it's compost and it's all that good decomposed organic matter, it doesn't mean that the plants are ready to absorb the nutrients from that compost. That compost still needs to be processed by the soil microbes in your garden bed. And that takes a little bit of time. Depending on how healthy your beds are, it may be just a few days, it might be a few weeks, it might be a few months. So the sooner you can get that compost into your bed, the sooner the plants are going to be able to benefit from it. And so the key difference, notice I'm talking specifically about compost. In the fall, I'll use compost, I'll use manure, I'll use dried grass clippings, I'll use crushed leaves. I use a lot of different organic matter in the fall to work into the soil because I have months for that to break down. But in the spring, you don't have that much time. So I recommend using compost, sifted compost, not big chunky compost, in spring so that it's mostly finished and mostly available to the plants. And then, with just a little bit of time, your finished compost is ready to release all of its magic, all of those wonderful nutrients into the soil so that the plant roots can take it up into the plant. So, if you haven't amended, amend in spring, but try to do it with a finished compost. That'll give you better results. If you use a bag of compost from the garden center and you open it up and it's chunky and filled with little bits of wood, I wouldn't recommend using that in the springtime because you're going to have to wait for that chunky compost to break down. And while it's decomposing, it's going to be taking nitrogen from the soil for that decomposition process. That's why you want to use a sifted finished compost, because you're not going to have the same nitrogen depletion because the decomposition is mostly complete at that time. Big Will Dog saying, who's going to watch the pups while you're away and how much will you miss them? My dogs are why I rarely leave town. I have trust issues with my fur babies. I am totally on the same page. So my granddaughters were visiting over the weekend. We had a sleepover and had a wonderful time. And they're going to be watching my pups along with my daughter and her significant other, of course. So it's going to be my family essentially that's watching my pups. It'll be at their house. And so Lika actually has two sisters that are my granddaughter's dogs. And so Lika will be joining her sisters for the period that I'm away. and Mala will just tolerate all of them the best she can. So that's the approach I take. I do have a great dog sitter. And so when I do shorter trips, I often and most often use my dog sitter. But for something long like this, yeah, I have the same issues as you. And so that's why the dogs will be with the family, and I will miss them. I've been telling them for a number of days that I'll be missing them. So uh, they they won't miss me as much because they'll be too busy playing. But usually about halfway through the trip, they start sitting and pining by the window waiting for me to come back. So I always see pictures of that. My dog sitter will send me those kind of pictures, and it makes my heart squeeze, of course. But I'm looking forward to the trip. I will be back, and we'll get back to normal with the pups. So thank you for asking that, because the dogs are definitely an important part of my travel considerations. And it's one of those things that I would travel much more if it weren't for that little bit of a limitation. Serena says, I heard that if you buy compost at the garden center, put it in your compost bin with half a cup each of green sand and kelp meal and turn daily 30 days before using. Yeah, so that basic idea is a good idea. If you get an unfinished compost, like is often sold at a garden center, adding it to your compost is a great way to finish it, to hasten the decomposition. Now, the green sand isn't really going to do much. So, green sand is a mineral that supplies potassium, and the potassium really isn't needed in the compost. It doesn't really do much until you use the compost, and it's not going to help with the decomposition one way or another. And the mineral component is not going to break down in the green sand. And so the kelp meal, yeah, so that can actually add a nitrogen component. And so a lot of the compost that we are buying in bags is heavy with the carbon. It's heavy with those little chunky pieces. And so adding the kelp meal to it in the compost pile and then turning it to maintain a hot pile in any pile, if you get the right mix, you should have compost in 30 days. So yeah, that basic idea is a valid one. You can just work the green sand into your beds if you have a potassium deficiency, and you don't have to worry about putting it into the compost. Most of our soils are probably okay with potassium. I'll use green sand like in container gardening, but I don't have a need to add green sand to my beds because my native soil, the soil that I mix in my beds, has enough potassium. So that's one of those things to keep an eye on. And if you are deficient in potassium after having done a soil test, then sure, adding the green sand can be one of those ways to get that nutrient back into your soil. EMK in Imkin says, I've seen some use liquid fertilizer to water in beds amended with bagged mixes to jumpstart decomposition before planting. Thoughts? Yes. And so I've actually mentioned this in a video or two when in the past when I've talked about amending in spring, is exactly that. And not just any fertilizer, but a high nitrogen fertilizer. And so when you're using the chunky mixes, or if you're using other organic matter that's not decomposed, you run into the risk of having a nitrogen deficiency. The bacteria breaking it down needs the nitrogen as well to do that decomposition. And they're going to do it at the expense of any plants that are growing in that bed. And so the way to overcome that, and the way to kind of boost the breakdown of that material, is exactly this: to fertilize with a nitrogen fertilizer so that you kind of counteract that potential deficiency. And a lot of plants, particularly if your soil isn't mature and healthy and filled with nutrients, then the fertilizer will benefit your soil, partly because of the decomposition, but also because you're deficient in that in a new mix or in a new bed. So, and it doesn't have to be liquid fertilizer. You could use pelletized fertilizer. The key difference is that a liquid fertilizer, like a synthetic water soluble fertilizer, is going to be immediately available in the soil. And so you'll be able to get that interaction going right away. You could use a slow release fertilizer. You can use any type of fertilizer, but there is a delay before that fertilizer is broken down by the soil microbes and then made available. So that's the idea behind the use of a liquid fertilizer versus a pelletized version. Now, when I do this, and I did it last year, as a matter of fact, that's kind of the approach I took. But I try to get the organic matter in as early as possible. And so last year I had one of my beds that I just didn't get to in the fall. So I needed to amend in the spring. The compost I was using wasn't fully finished yet. And I used a pelletized, not a synthetic, but a slow release organic fertilizer, like blood meal, for instance. And that takes a while for it to benefit the soil. Because I was doing this early in the spring, I was okay with that, because I kind of looked at it as about the time that the blood meal is starting to break down, it will start benefiting all that rough organic matter, the compost that is also starting to break down. And so that's one of the few times that I will fertilize in my beds. And it's exactly this reason. I'm using it specifically for the soil and for the microbes in the soil and for the decomposition of the organic matter in the soil. I'm not using it to fertilize my plants. And so that's why I say that the focus on the soil in the spring is really the approach. And there's lots of different ways to do it. So make that effort to get your soil going. And that can really make a difference in the end of your season because you started so well. Llama Llama is asking, yesterday my neighbor gave me a coffee can seed pack filled with old generic tomato, cabbage, radish seeds from 1999. I'll be planting them to see what grows. Any advice? Yeah, I say do it. That's cool. I actually have some pepper seeds from 2019, I think it was, that I germinated this year. And I got about a 20% germination rate. So not a lot, but that's what you can expect is low germination rates, especially from 1999. You can take a couple different approaches depending on how many seeds you have and do a germination test. I'd show this in one of my videos where you take the paper towel, you put the seeds on it, you wet the paper towel, you put it into a plastic bag, you put it in a warm spot like on top of your refrigerator, and then you wait to see how the seeds germinate. And so if you do 10 seeds is kind of the easy math way to do it. So do 10 seeds and then wait. And you should see germination, particularly of the tomato and the cabbage and the radish, most of the generic seeds that we put in our vegetable garden. You should see germination within 5 days. Now, the video I made, I was doing a test of some old pepper seeds. And at the end of 3 weeks, I did not have germination. So if you watch that video, you will see me say, it looks like these pepper seeds aren't going to germinate. Well, made the video, released the video, and like 2 days later, those pepper seeds started germinating. So peppers are notorious for taking a long time. It took almost 4 weeks for those pepper seeds. And I want to say those pepper seeds were like 8 years old, but all the rest were germinating within the first week. So if you do a germination test like that, you can see and have an expectation of how those seeds are going to germinate. And so let's say, for example, the tomato seeds you were given, do a germination test. If none of them germinate, do another germination test. If none of them germinate, then you won't waste your effort by putting those seeds into pots and waiting for them to grow. That's the purpose of doing a germination test, is just to see if it's a waste of time to try to grow them in your garden or to try to grow them in pots. So that would be the advice, is just to do a germination test beforehand to avoid the time and effort and potting mix and pots and whatever else you're going to be using. If you can find out right away that they're no longer viable, you'll just save yourself some of that effort. Prayer Warrior says, I've been adding my rabbit manure to my raised beds, just a little worried about the hay that's mixed in. So rabbit manure can be great as a soil amendment. I have used rabbit manure. I like to put it in the compost. Most manures I like to put in the compost pile first. The rabbit manure in particular, because it's a cold manure, it doesn't have all the ammonia and high nitrogen values. You can put it directly in the soil, absolutely, and it'll break down. Hay, I do caution using hay, and so that may be why you're a little worried. So I like to use straw in my beds as a mulch, and one of the reasons I use straw is because I've used hay in my beds in the past, and it just became a nightmare weeding the beds. The key difference between straw and hay is that hay is a bedding material for farm animals. So it's primarily the stalks of the plants that should have very few seeds in it. Hay is a feed for the livestock. So it's going to have a lot of seeds in it. So when you use hay, you're much more likely to get all those little seeds to sprout and germinate and grow. And that can be a lot of work. And so I haven't used hay in probably 15 years because the last time I did it, I just had an extra seedy batch and I was spending all season just weeding the beds that I had put the hay into. So just be aware that that's one of those issues. But I'm glad to see you're using your rabbit manure. That's a great thing to be able to get in there. Dennis says, did you have a chance to visit Forestier Underground Gardens in Fresno when you're stationed at Castle? Super place to visit and all underground. I did not. I want to do a trip. So you might be familiar with this. So Castle Air Force Base actually has a little air museum. As far as I know, it's still open. But the KC-135, that tanker that was on display in that air museum was one that I actually flew. And I actually flew on one of the very last flights of that plane before it was moved to the air museum. So I want to go back there to see if that museum is still open and to see if my plane is still there. But Fresno's not that far away. So yeah, thanks, Dennis. I'll check that out when I get to that California vacation sometime in the next year or two. There's a lot planned between now and then. So we'll see. Dennis Blevins gifted a Gardner Scott membership. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I saw earlier that Minnesota Gardening has joined the channel as a member. So thank you for that. It's so wonderful to have new members and to be able to share this community that we have. So thank you for that, Minnesota Gardening, and to you as well, Dennis. And look forward to seeing whoever you gifted it to online with the rest of us and maybe joining for the long term. Aaron is saying, gourds are popping up out of the soil again this spring from the gourds I bought at the store last year. Cool. Had a bumper crop last year in the fall. They ended up being similar species of gourd. So let's move into this. This is a great topic to talk about in the spring. And I've already been doing this. So when I get out in the garden in spring, one of the things I look for are the plants that are popping up. So I did a video a couple weeks ago where I was talking about the chives because the chives are active right now. And I have some chive plants that are popping up in my asparagus beds. And I also have some salvia plants that are popping up in my asparagus beds because near my asparagus beds, I have chives growing and I have salvia growing. So anytime you're growing a plant that's going to set seed, even if it's a gourd, if a gourd falls to the ground and the seeds pop up, you might have more new gourds popping in that same spot. It's a good opportunity to transplant. So I've been transplanting a lot of different things that are popping up in my garden. Even currants. I've got a big currant bush, and the currants will send out the underground roots and they'll pop up into new plants. And so I dug up some of those to transplant into an area of the garden. So A lot of gardeners, and I do this as well, but a lot of gardeners look at springtime, you should look at springtime as a time to do your weeding. The perennial weeds are starting to pop up in spring. You want to get rid of those perennial weeds while they're still small and still manageable. But a lot of these other plants are popping up as well. So go ahead and dig them out, pot them up, move them to another area, expand your garden with the plants you already have. Gourds is a great idea, especially if it's a variety that you've already discovered does well. Yeah, save some of those plants and let them grow. My tomato plants, I'll do that with. There's so many tomatoes end up falling to the ground because I grow so many tomato plants. Some of them will sprout in spring and start growing. And if I remember which tomato it is, and I usually keep track of where I put my tomato plants, I have a pretty good idea. And so that's kind of a head start on the season. You can dig up that tomato plant that's growing outside and put it in another spot, or just leave it in that same spot and let it keep growing. So take advantage of your springtime volunteers and use that to expand your garden. So I've added chives all over the garden. I've added some of those salvias, yarrow. My yarrow, it spread pretty well last year, and I had some new plants popping up around the edges. So I dug up some of those yarrow plants and moved them over by my apple trees. So great opportunity to basically get free plants. You already paid for those plants one way or another, either with the seed that you started growing or when you bought them as a potted plant. But do take advantage of the free plants in your own garden in springtime. When you do that, do look at the forecast. And this is why spring is such a good time of year to do it. So for me, I still have cool nights and I'm still having some overcast days. I do get a little bit of rain in the springtime. And that's when you want to do it. You want to dig up these plants, hopefully for you and for the plant, on an overcast day where it's a little bit cool. And then you can move it to its new location, water it in, and it's not going to be burned by the heat of the sun. There's a reason we don't do much transplanting in the middle of summer. The sun is just too intense and it's too much of a shock on the plants. But if you do it in spring, when the overall conditions are relatively cool, you can have much more success with your transplants. Shandy's garden is asking, I've never ever tried blood meal or bone meal, but it always reminds me of bone broth. Could I use bone broth to water the garden? Would those nutrients be readily available? So yes and no. So the thing about bone broth, depending on how you make your bone broth. So bone broth is generally made to get the bone marrow, and maybe if you've roasted your bones to get some of that taste, and then also you might have left some of the meat and some of the fat on the bones. So bone broth tends to have some of that meaty, that marrow, that fatty material in it. You can use it in the garden, but anytime you're going to put a human food in your garden, you increase the risk of dogs, mice, rats, go through the list of an animal that might want to dig up a good fatty meal out of your soil. So I would hesitate about using bone broth like that. You can, however, do it like eggshells, for instance. People will take their eggshells and they'll boil their eggshells, and then they'll use that water in their garden. Now, when you actually look at the studies, it really doesn't add much calcium when you boil an eggshell, but it's the same basic idea. If you have a bone that is clean of all that other material and you boil it, then yes, some of the materials in the bone, some of that calcium, some of that potassium, some of the stuff that is naturally occurring will go into the water, and you can use that in your garden. But I don't think that the amount of the nutrients is really going to be very high. And so it doesn't hurt anything to do it, except for the potential of an animal digging it up because it's going to be tasty. But I don't think it's going to be adding as many nutrients as you might think it would add. A a better way to get some of those nutrients in the soil is really, quite honestly, compost. You look at a plant like a dandelion, and so a dandelion has that big tap root. It's going into the soil and it's absorbing the nutrients in your soil and bringing it up through the roots and then into the leaves. And so if you've got a calcium deficiency in your soil, get your dandelions and turn your dandelions into compost. The dandelions will release all of their iron and all their calcium. Dandelions and a lot of other plants are just loaded with nutrients. That is a much more efficient way and a way to actually get more nutrients into your compost and into your garden than to boil it and get a weak solution that really, in many respects, isn't worth the effort. So, I mean, if you got extra time and you want to do it, sure, go for it. But I think there's a lot better ways, and it really does come down to the compost. Rebecca's asking, what is your opinion on mushroom soil? So if you're talking like mushroom compost, and so we'll talk mushroom compost and we'll talk a little bit about mushroom soil because they're very closely mixed or matched. And so I was just looking at a bag that I had gotten last year of mushroom compost. It's important that you know the source and that you read the ingredients on the bag, read the description on the bag. Because when we talk about mushroom compost, there are two different types. So mushroom growers will use a woody soil because mushrooms are the fruit of the fungus that's growing in the soil. And the fungus feeds on the woody material in the soil. So mushroom growers tend to use really fibrous, really woody soil. And then the fungus breaks it down. And after it matures, it sends up its fruit. And that's what the mushrooms are. So a soil that has been used to grow mushrooms can be a very rich soil. It's the fungi have broken down that woody material, and depending on the quality of that type of mushroom compost, it's loaded with nutrients, and it doesn't have a lot of big chunks, and it's already got a fungal network in it that you can incorporate into your soil if you use that as an amendment, because you really should have fungal networks in your garden beds. But a lot of the compost, the mushroom compost that we'll buy at a garden center, when you read the bag, it says, this is the kind of mix that mushroom growers use. And that's the bag I have. So it hasn't been broken down. It doesn't have any fungal networks. There's no mycelia to add to your garden beds. It's basically just chunky pieces of wood that are in a mix. So depending on how you're planning to use it, like I was talking about at the very beginning of the show, when you add a compost that's chunky, that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's like a mushroom compost that is brand new, it's fresh, it's just the wood pieces. So be aware that there's that key. And so when we talk about mushroom soil, we're generally talking about the first of those compost mixes. We're talking about what the mushroom growers were actually growing in. And so if you can find a mushroom soil, one that has actually been used by a grower, yeah, I think that's much better to use than that raw bag that is sold as mushroom compost. And that's why it's important to be aware of what it is you're using, because I use that mushroom compost, but I usually sift it. I'm aware that it's just raw wood for the most part. The one that I use, and when you read the bag, it'll say this is a mix used for mushroom growing. And then you look at the ingredients and it'll be forest products. That's all the wood. But then it might also include other things. So the mixes, or the bag that I will occasionally buy, has wood, it has peat moss, it has, I think it has rabbit manure in it. There's a lot of different ingredients. So I sift it to get rid of all those chunky woody bits. And then I'm left with a raw compost. I mean, it's partly broken down, and I can add that to my beds. And that's the kind of thing that I like to do in fall. But once I've sifted it, if I could do it in spring and have a couple months for the soil microbes to break it down even more, then that can be an option. But it's not because of the woody bits, it's because of all those other things that are in the mix. So just be aware of that. And even if you use a mushroom soil or a mushroom growers mix that has been used, I would still sift out to get any of those big woody chunks out of it before I put it into my garden bed, particularly in the springtime. So good. Yeah, Dennis says the Castle Museum is still alive. Cool. They had the best hamburgers there. I would take my students. So the Castle Air Force Base used to be the school for the KC-135, and I was an instructor pilot at the school. And I would take my students to the Castle Air Museum for the hamburgers. And, such delicious, delicious hamburgers. So I'll go back, and yeah, Gina's saying it's open but underfunded. I'll go and spend some money. Definitely going to make that trip because it needs to stay active and needs to stay open because partly because I've got that connection to it, but I think it's important for a lot of people to have exposure to those kind of things. Big Will Dog says, I'm running low on organic granular. Is a higher NPK organic granular better for long term, less needed, or would the lower and more often be better? Depends on what kind of material is used in the organic granular fertilizer. So when we talk about the nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus and potassium, sometimes they'll use like urea, which can be organic. That's the nitrogen source, and it breaks down pretty quickly. But there are other nitrogen sources, like the blood meal, for instance, that take longer to break down. And you go through the phosphorus and the potassium as well. It depends on what kind of ingredients they're using to get that granular fertilizer, even if it's organic. And so that will tell you kind of the long term, and it should give you an idea of the whether it's slow release or quick release. And the good companies will often give you an idea of how much time it's going to take for that to happen. And so that's not an easy question to answer. I would say, yeah, I like using the organic granular fertilizers, and by doing it more often doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting a more even distribution of those nutrients because of that time component. You may actually end up putting too much of a nutrient, particularly the nitrogen. So if I were doing my tomatoes and I put an organic fertilizer on and I saw no response to my tomatoes, like most gardeners, my thought would be, oh, I need to add more fertilizer. So then I put more fertilizer on and don't see any response from my tomatoes. And it's like, oh, I guess I better put more fertilizer on. Well, what's happening is you're heaping fertilizer on top of fertilizer, and it takes a while for that to break down. So by the time the end of the season comes, all of that fertilizer, all that organic pelletized granular fertilizer has broken down. And now you've got an abundance of nitrogen in your tomato beds. And then you wonder why you're not getting any flowers and why you're not getting any fruit, but the bushes are just so bright, vibrant green and big. It's because you over fertilized with the nitrogen. So be careful about that. I always say, why are you using the fertilizer in the first place? And then take into account what it is and how long it takes to become available. And then that will help with the dosing, figuring out exactly how much you need to do. And so I do it like in my green stock towers. I use fertilizer in container gardening because I don't have that good soil life developing the soil. I have to add the nutrients. I do it through the organic fertilizers, and I do it the same way with the granular, and I mix it with my potting mix so that I can grow the green stalks. But I do it like, for me right now, I do it in April because I'm not going to do most of my growing in the green stock until May. So I've got a month at least for it to break down and become available. So that's the approach I take when I use organic fertilizers like that. And it's only because I know I'm going to need it when it comes time for those plants to start growing in a couple months. Rebecca's saying that garlic is booming right now. I didn't fertilize last year or amend. What and when should I add, if anything? I have garden tone on hand. So garlic being a root crop, this is another one of those things, kind of like I was just talking about with the tomatoes. And so you'll see this with garlic, with beets, with carrots, with all the root crops. If you use a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen, you might not get the bulb development. You might not get the root development because the plant is going to absorb that nitrogen and put it into the leaves, put it into the green growth. And so I'm not sure what the mix is of the NPK in the garden tone, but just be aware of that. I would be hesitant to use a nitrogen fertilizer on the garlic, assuming there's a deficiency of the other nutrients in the bed. If that bed has grown well, and last year it grew well, you'll probably get by without needing any fertilizer or amending. You can put compost on top. And so I'll do this with my garlic beds. I'll put a compost on top of the beds so that when I water, the compost effectively becomes like a compost tea. The nutrients in the compost will leach into the soil. So that's one way of getting a nice easy blend of some extra nutrients. But I wouldn't try to mix it into the soil because you could disrupt the roots. And then if you do determine that you need a fertilizer, if you need other nutrients, it's really the phosphorus and then a little bit of the potassium. So the middle number and the third number in your fertilizer mix, that's what you need to be looking at if you're growing the root vegetables and you want to get a good bulb or root development. But you may not need it. You know, there have been years that I've grown garlic in the same bed, and because I'm getting the bed ready for my garlic, I try to amend before I put the garlic in, but there's been times it hasn't happened. And I just go with it because I know my soil can handle 2 years of a plant without depleting the nutrients in it. So if your soil is generally good, you really might not need anything. And that's really the biggest question, is how good your soil is and whether you need the nutrients or not. And a lot of times you really don't need it. So sunset gazing, thanks for the advice. Already picking blackberries, pomegranates are blooming, hummingbirds are everywhere. Spring has definitely sprung. Awesome. That's so cool. I'm glad that you have that. I was showing my granddaughters over the weekend that I've got birds in my birdhouses. So I talked about it on Instagram a few weeks back, where I was cleaning out my birdhouses. And so my birdhouses were clean. And then a little over a week ago, I was walking by one of the birdhouses and I saw all the little sticks sticking out of the cracks in the birdhouse. And I kind of peered into it. I've got nests in my birdhouses. So I love springtime. When we talk about some of those other spring activities, those are some things to think about. If you have birdhouses and you haven't cleaned them out yet, and the birds haven't moved in, maybe they haven't moved in because it's a dirty birdhouse and it's filled with old nests. So clean out your birdhouses and invite the birds in to build nests in them. And then if you've got hummingbirds, by all means, be ready for the hummingbirds. Now, my hummingbirds are still a few weeks away. And so I'll do this when I get back from my trip. But start setting up hummingbird feeders before the hummingbirds are supposed to appear. That way, when they do appear, you've got the food for them and they'll stick around. The hummingbirds are quite territorial. And so if they see your garden, they're migrating, they see your garden, they come in and they find good food, they're going to probably stick around. They're going to stake a claim on your garden, and you'll have hummingbirds throughout the season. So that's another great spring activity if you live in an area with hummingbirds. But all the other birds hold true as well. And so my granddaughters and I are going to be building some new birdhouses to attract some different kinds of birds so that we have a good blend of the birds in our garden to just sit and enjoy. We did that yesterday morning. We got up and just sat underneath the gazebo in the middle of my garden, and I told them, just listen. And we heard a robin, we heard doves, we heard the wrens, we heard the sparrows. And so I just love sitting in the garden and listening to the different kinds of birds. And the more you do it, the more you'll become familiar with the birds and their sounds. And it really can be a great way to do it. So use spring to attract those birds to your garden. Spring is a wonderful time to have the birds in your garden, because what's also being attracted to your garden in spring? It's those garden pests. It's the grasshoppers. It's the larva that's emerging from the soil. Well, when a bird, the typical garden birds, is nesting and it lays an egg, and then suddenly that fledgling awakens, it's hungry. And you probably know this, that the adult birds spend all day just feeding the babies. Where are they getting that food? Your garden. And what are they feeding those babies? The caterpillars and the larvae and all the other little insects that are on your garden plants. So if you've had pest problems in the past, you can do a little bit of research and find out what kind of birds eat that pest. And you might be able to attract those birds to your garden by building a birdhouse in spring and attracting those birds, and they'll take care of the pest for you. Suddenly, you've eradicated the pest, because their life cycle of waking up and emerging from the soil as a larva to then eat your plant, the bird is right there to pluck it out of the ground and feed it to their baby. So I love having birdhouses in the garden, and this is a good time of year to go ahead and start some of those activities. So think about that as the activity that you're doing, the hummingbirds, the other birds, but then the butterflies and the moths as well, all the pollinators. If you don't have a pollinator garden yet, start one this year. You might need to go to a nursery and get some of your plants to start with, because a lot of those plants, particularly the perennial plants, may take a couple years before they flower. But this is one of those instances where if you want a real quick action in your garden, it could be because you buy a flowering plant. Normally, when I go to the garden center or the nursery, I wait till the end of the season. I get everything on clearance. I don't care that all of the blooms have fallen off. I have a perennial plant that I get at a bargain. I put it in the ground, and the next year is going to flower for me. But if you want that really quick response, go ahead and buy a flowering plant, put it in the garden, and you may be attracting butterflies within hours as they're flying around looking for all that delicious nectar and pollen. So keep that in mind, is when you're going to add to the garden. It's a good idea, if you like that idea, to plan for it. So in fall, that's kind of the thing I'm doing. I'm thinking about what flowers I want in spring, and then either start the seeds or get the bulbs, because most of the spring flowering plants you're going to put in the ground in fall, and then they get established, and then they overwinter, and then they pop up in spring. So fall, spring, same basic idea. You got to think about what the flowers are that you want in your garden, and then plant appropriately. A lot of the spring planting is going to give us the fall flowers. And so if you like the fall flowers, or you need a balance, so you have spring flowers and fall flowers, start looking at some of those bulbs that you plant in spring to then get that later flowering. And so that's why I say there's a lot of similarities between the spring and the fall, because we have to look at these type of activities and plan for them. And so if you're going to put some bulbs in spring, put some bulbs in fall, and just make that kind of your normal pattern of operation. And before you know it, you're going to have a vibrant garden filled with flowers throughout the year. Jason is asking, I know nitrogen can prevent blooms from happening. Does that mean you can use nitrogen to delay plants bolting? Not really. So bolting is not really because of the nitrogen. Bolting is typically because of the stress on the plant. And so a plant, and generally it is the cool season plant. So we're talking lettuce and spinach and beets. Those are the kind of plants that like cool weather. We start them in spring and they start growing. If they're exposed to a lot of heat, dry wind, the kind of conditions that I have in my garden that are stressful for the plant is going to respond by sending up a flower stalk. The whole point that a plant lives for is to produce seed. And so when a plant gets that kind of stress, it says, oh, my life is about over. I need to send up a flower stalk and I need to set seed. So that's really what causes the bolting. When you use a plant like that, or when you take a plant like that and you add the nitrogen, you might get a quick burst of new growth. Well, you almost always will get a quick burst of new growth. But as we go into the summer, that new growth now is more fragile and it's more likely that it will be attacked by pests and damaged by the sun. So those two things, nitrogen and bolting, there's minimal relationship between the two. You can delay the plants from blooming, so you can get bigger plants if you do it right. And then when, assuming your season is long enough, then when the plants begin blooming and fruiting, you're going to have a bigger plant. And so theoretically, more blooms and more fruit. But it's really not going to affect the bolting. That comes down to what's happening in your garden, which is why I use shade cloth, for instance. Shade cloth is a way to reduce and slow the likelihood of the bolting, because you're protecting those plants from the sun with that shade cloth. So that's really the way to start looking at it. It's not from the nitrogen perspective, but from the weather perspective and whether you can actually make a difference. Welcome to Shannon McGinnis, a new member. That's fantastic. Thank you for joining the channel. Look for all those perks that you get when you join the channel, and hope to see you on Facebook and some of the other opportunities that we have. That's cool. Troll is saying birds won't come to my feeders until there's leaves on the trees. They need somewhere to hide from predators. So good point. And so, yeah, if you live in Scandinavia, or if you live like me in the Rocky Mountains at a high elevation, the trees haven't leafed out yet, or maybe they're just starting to leaf out. And that's why I say now's the time to start thinking about building birdhouses, because the birds are just starting to appear and they're going to need a little bit of protection. The bushes, the trees definitely offer the protection. So depending on what kind of birds you have, there might be a delay. They might need that protection. Now, what I do, I have a National Wildlife Fund certified garden area, and I have big piles of brush. So when I trim my trees, I'll just put them into big piles. And part of the reason for that is bird protection, because during the year, my neighbor has lots of big, tall trees, and my trees are starting to get bigger. They offer a little bit of protection. But early in the year, particularly for the younger birds that can't fly as far, having a brush pile might be the difference in the survival of those birds. So you're exactly right. They need a place to hide from predators. And if you can help them out, that is definitely an approach to take. So the feeders you put, and also when you put the feeders out. So I think about my sister-in-law that has bird feeders out, and she has cats, and so she has to be aware that when she puts her bird feeders out, she puts them in an area that the cats can't get to. So there's a lot of different bird predators, and you may have some living with you in your house. Cats kill a lot of birds, and you need to be aware of that when you take some of those activities to encourage the birds that are coming. Ross says, we have nesting eastern bluebirds and chipping sparrows in our garden. Oh, that's awesome. They love the garden and have been extremely active at close range, feeding, perching, and courting. Isn't that so cool to see? I love sitting. And so I'll look at my birdhouses and the parents working together. So you'll have one parent that is standing watch, and so I have tall hooks like that stand like 10 feet tall to hold my bird feeders where I put the bird seed. And so the birds that are in my birdhouses one of the birds will be at the top of that hook, and they stand watch, and then the other parent is getting the food, and you can almost set your watch by it. It's so cool. So they'll leave the nest, they'll fly out, and depending on the different kind of birds and what else is happening in the area, they'll come back like 45 seconds or 50 seconds later. They'll duck their head through the hole, they'll feed the babies, they'll bring their head out, they look at the other parent to make sure the coast is clear, and then they do it again. And every 45 minutes or 45 seconds to a minute, for hours, they're getting the food. Now, they're only flying 45 seconds or a minute away. Well, what is within that distance? It's my garden. So I can see them fly off to the side near my beds, go down to the ground. Who knows what they're plucking off the ground, and then flying back to the nest. So yeah, they can be extremely active with that whole process of the feeding and the perching and the protecting. But yeah, the courtship, I love the courtship as well. So cool. That's awesome that you have that. And definitely take full advantage of it. Get out there and just watch and learn and see what's happening. And I just think it's so much fun. It really is a great way to not work in the garden, but still just have that wonderful gardening experience, that gardening exposure. and it's the nature, it's the things that are happening. Suburban Hillbilly says some birds are predators to other birds. Yeah, this is another thing to be aware of, and this is a good point as well. So I was talking with my neighbor recently about the owl that we have in our neighborhood, and I see the owl perched on his house, and he was telling me he sees the owl perched on my house. And usually it's very early in the morning. Sometimes it's late, just after dusk, but the owl is hunting, absolutely. And so a big reason why it's on his house and my house is probably because of the bird activity between my yard and my other neighbor's yard, the one that has all the trees. There's a lot of birds, and so the owl is definitely there. I've got hawks in my area as well, and so I'll see the hawks circling overhead. And there's been a few times I've been in the garden, and that hawk has swooped right through my garden on the way to whatever it is attacking. And so you need to be aware of that as well, that when you put up your feeders and you put up your bird houses, that the protection is not just for the cats or the raccoons or whatever else might want the birds. It could be other birds. And so thinking about how a hawk or an owl would fly, they need to fly in, they need to attack, and then they need to fly out. And so if you can disrupt that by having the big tall bird feeder, or you put your birdhouse near a tree, or you put it in a tree, that can reduce that type of predator from being able to get to the birds when they're most vulnerable during their feeding and during the time that they're sitting in their house. So yeah, that's a good bit of advice, is just to be aware of all the different types of predators that you have in the area, because it can make a big difference to the day of that bird that didn't see the hawk coming. So some of the other things that I want to talk about when we are thinking about the spring activities that also become the fall activities. Think about your tools. And so I like to encourage that you get your tools sharpened and cleaned in fall so that you can store them over the winter. They're not going to rust. And then you pull them out in spring and they're ready to use. But if you're like me and most gardeners, that's not going to happen. There's just other things that get in the way and you forget to do it. You need to do it in spring. You need to clean your tools. You need to sharpen your tools. You need to get your gardening toolkit all ready to go so that you can begin using it. Replace some of your broken tools. I broke one of my trowels last year, a trowel that I had for about 20 years because I was digging up some weeds just outside my gazebo, and there was a root running through there, and I thought I would just pop that root out. Well, it ended up being a thicker root, a tree root, and I snapped my trowel. I was extremely surprised. I had a conversation with a gardener friend who snapped their hori-hori knife in kind of the same way. And so that may happen like at the end of the season or very early in the season, unless you remember to replace that tool. Now you're going to get out one day and you want to do your activities and your favorite tool is gone. Think about your tools. Think about replacing the tools. Think about adding the new tools that you've been waiting to do. And when you take care of your tools and you have all your tools in place ready to go in spring, it just makes the whole process so much easier. The planting, all the prep, it's just so much easier when you've taken that effort, either in spring or in fall, to get your garden going. And so I'm working a little bit on that. My pruners, the one pruner, when I went out to actually start pruning my apple trees a month or so ago when they were still dormant, and it was cold. It was starting to get a little dull. It wasn't as sharp as it used to be. Luckily, I have a very small file that's specifically designed for sharpening the edges on secateurs or pruners. And that's a great spring activity to do so that you're ready with your pruning as you move forward. So add that to your list of things to take care of. Colorblind Gardener, hello to you. Thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate the support. Asking, my strawberry beds have settled 1 foot. Do I need to pull up all of my strawberry plants to top off the beds and then replant them all? I have a video on this. I did a video on this last year. And so I'm sure Jay's going to find it. I think I called it replenishing or revitalizing a strawberry bed. And so you kind of do what you're thinking of doing. Okay. So what I show in that video, and this is how I do it, is you leave the strawberries in place and to start, and then you anticipate that you're going to be doing the revitalizing of your strawberry bed. And so you can do it a couple different ways. If you do it early enough in the season, like this is a fall time activity for a lot of people. And that's when I made the video, and that's what I show. So you will pot up the runners. So I'll put little pots in the bed and then direct the runners into those pots, or I'll direct the runners into a bare spot and then let them root and grow into little plants. In the other side of the bed that I first want to revitalize, I'll pull up all the old strawberry plants. If there are some of those new young plants that I had rooted, I'll dig them up and put them off to the side, usually in a little pot. But then once that half of the bed is cleared out, I amend it and I add some new soil and I bring the level up. So you'll see in the video, my level had dropped about 6 inches. So try to get to it maybe a little more often so that you don't have to add a foot of new material. But basically, you're adding a foot of soil and amendments and potting mix, whatever you use in your strawberry beds. And then once that level has been raised, now I just do it one side of a bed at a time. I find that a little bit easier. You could do the whole bed all at once. Just dig up all those little plants, put them in a nice protected area so they don't get fried by the sun, or pot them up, and then add new soil and amendments, organic matter, bring the level up, and then take all those little plants that you had prepared for and put them back into the bed. So that's really I think the best way to do it when you have a foot, 6 inches to a foot that needs to be brought in and the level raised. You can do it with the plants that are in place. Now, a lot of times those really big strawberry plants that are already 2 or 3 years old, they're not going to be producing the next year anyway. A lot of the strawberries we're growing only have about a 3-year lifespan where they're productive. And so at the end of the 3rd year, you should be removing your strawberry plants. This is a great time to do this kind of revitalizing, is to just take those old plants and toss them. You don't need to replant them. The ones you want to replant are the young plants. And you could do it in place. I did this on the other half of the garden. I didn't show it in the video, but I would just dig up some of those young plants, heap in some of the new material, and then just drop that plant back into effectively the same location, but with new fresh soil underneath. So that's the basic idea. But don't pull them up. You can pull up the old ones to toss in the compost pile, but dig up those smaller ones so that you minimize the root damage and treat them as transplants, because they're going to be going back into the bed. So check out that video, because hopefully once you see how I did it, that it'll explain it a little bit better, and you can get a little better understanding of how it is. Wasabi Gal says, I want to move my strawberries into a green stalk from my garden bed. When and how? So a few weeks ago, I did my video on growing strawberries in my green stalk, and I show how I did it with the bare root plants, but it's the same with the active plants. Use the little plants and they'll get established right away. So check out that video of how to grow strawberries in a green stalk, and that should give you a good idea of the approach I take of putting the strawberries into the green stalk. You can do it in spring. Like right now, my strawberries are waking up, and some of those plants that sprouted last year, so now they're a year old, you can dig those up and put them into the green stalk while they're still young, and they'll root and take over, and you'll have the strawberries this year. So that's definitely one approach to take. I did the bare root strawberries, which were, again, at this time of year a year ago. Or you can wait a little bit later in the season and do it in early fall. A lot depends on your climate and your weather and how long your season is going to be, because the strawberries are going to need at least a month to get established for the new roots to grow and for the plant to overcome that shock of transplanting. So early spring will work, early fall will work. And yeah, it's definitely a viable option. One of the other things I want to talk about, since we're talking about green stalks, is in spring, take advantage of the spring holidays, because a lot of the nurseries and a lot of the garden centers are trying to get gardeners in to buy stuff. So there are great sales. So here in the United States, Mother's Day and Memorial Day holidays are some of the best times of year to do the shopping of your garden supplies, because there are some great sales going on. So I'm always checking the nurseries, the garden centers, my online friends to see what kind of sales they have. And coincidentally, Greenstock has their Mother's Day sale coming up in just a couple of days. This is their biggest sale of the year. And so from May 1st to May 15th, Greenstock has a sale on most of their items. And so the accessories, the items, and the nice thing about it, and I've got a link in the description below with the Greenstock, is that they have the additional discount. So if you order something more than $75, you can use the Gardner Scott code and you get a discount of $10 on your order. So yeah, this is a great time of year. If you're thinking about getting a green stock, get it between May 1st and May 15th, because you can get some really good bargains and you can get that extra $10 discount. Harvest Right. I just got an email from Harvest Right, the freeze dryer company. I love my freeze dryer. They're having a sale all through the month of May. You can save hundreds of dollars, and you use the link I've got below. You can go to Harvest Right and check it out, and you can use the Gardner Scott code for additional discount. And so I think it saves a couple $100. I forget exactly how much it is when you click on that link and use the Gardner Scott code. And when you do it during a sale, now freeze dryers are not cheap. Yeah, that's why it was 20 years before I got my freeze dryer. But a month like May, when you add up all that stuff, I think it's like a $500 savings. So if you've been thinking about a freeze dryer, May could be the time to do it. So look at all of those different things. Epic Gardening is having some big sales coming up in the next couple of weeks as well. And I've got the link in the Gardner Scott code below as well. So I know a lot of these sites are places you're already going to. And now you throw the Gardner Scott code in there and you do it during a time of year like right now where they're having these sales. And I like saving money, and I like planning my year around saving money. Spring can be a good time to really get some of those things that you've been waiting for, that you've been saving up for. Start checking it out, because it could be the opportunity that you've been waiting for. And sometimes it might be 2 weeks, like with green stock, or it might be the whole month, like with the Harvest Right. You just got to check it out and see if it fits with your budget and your planning, and it might be a good opportunity for you to get out there and add to your toolbox, add to your gardening toolbox. It's I don't like spending money except when it's gardening related, and I don't like to spend money with the gardening related activities unless I have to. So I'm always looking for a way to save a buck, and those are a couple ways to do it. Yeah, Shawnee Grows says shop the sales for sure. And it holds true for a lot of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can take advantage of. I got my gazebo in fall a couple years ago now, by shopping an end of season clearance when they were putting things like that on sale. So that's why I say there's so many similarities between spring and fall. In the spring, you see the sales because they want you to come into the store. And then in late summer and early fall, they want to get rid of their stuff because they're clearing out their inventory. So take advantage of those kind of things, and you might be able to really save it. Outlier Gardener says, I think my hubby will be getting me a green stock for Mother's Day. Nice. Well, if he hasn't got it yet, drop a hint that he can save some money by waiting just a couple days. Mother's Day isn't here yet, so you can actually, and this is their biggest sale of the year, which means they sell more green stocks during this time. So get in on May 1st or May 2nd to make sure that you have a quick turnaround. They're great people. They have a quick turnaround, but when they have the big sales like this, they might fall a few days behind. So get in there early, and you might be able to take advantage of that. Okay, boy, the time is just flying today. I'm so excited just for springtime and getting out there. Yeah, thanks, Jay. Jay says, get Gardner Scott's book, Gardner Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening. I've got the link below. I think Amazon has mostly figured out their problems with stocking the book. So you can order it, and you might actually get it within a couple days, compared to a lot of you that were so supportive and waited weeks because they just couldn't get their act together. But I know I checked on it here locally, and I can get it same day shipping now from Amazon. So I know my local warehouse has it in stock. So maybe yours does too. At the worst, it might take a couple days, but thank you for that, Jay. Yeah, that's another great thing to do. I actually didn't have it on my list, but I like the idea. In springtime, When you start spending more time outside, take a good book with you. If you like to read books and you haven't read a book in the garden, do it. If you have read a book in the garden, you probably know what I'm talking about. Sitting outside when it's cool, not too cold, warm, not too hot. You can hear the birds, and then you just are chilling, reading a nice book. Such an enjoyable way to spring to spend the spring warm weather. And the Gardener's Got book, sure. I'd love to have you check out my book. I have a section. I break it down to how you garden throughout the year. And I talk about some of these spring activities. I talk more about some of the garden prep. I talk more about trellising and planning and the planting in spring in the book than I have today. But that's a great option. Yeah, get Gardener Scott's book and read it in the garden and figure out some of those things that we didn't have time to talk about today. So thanks for putting that up there, Jay. I do appreciate it. So Rush J6 is saying, hi, relatively new gardener. Hello to you. Especially with flowers. My question isn't about sales, but flowers. I actually cut my Clematis that was climbing over my arch. Is it dead now or will it come back? It should come back. Now there's a couple different types of the Clematis. So some will sprout from the base and grow from the base throughout the year and flower. And they do that repeating. So most of the flowering happens on that new growth that emerges from the base. Some varieties grow from the old growth as far as the flowers are concerned. They'll still send up some of the new sprouts at the bottom, but those new sprouts might not flower in that first year. So it depends on the variety you have, but you should see some new growth. So I just planted some last year. That was one of my fall activities last year, was to put 2 plants in near my gazebo to grow up my gazebo corners. And that's what I'm seeing this year. Is I had a single stalk running from the small plant that I put in the ground. And now as I look at it, I see multiple sprouts that are starting to appear, because that's just the way it grows. So I doubt that it's dead. Just have a little bit of patience and take a look at it, and then you'll be able to see some of that growth coming up. If you don't see it happening in spring, then yeah, it might have incurred more damage with however it was that you cut it, whenever it was that you cut it. And if it's not showing that new growth, then there's a bigger issue. And sadly, yeah, maybe it is dead. But chances are, as long as you planted it correctly and as long as you put it in a good spot, that it will sprout for you, even if that first stem after you put it in the ground was cut off. The one that I have, for instance, because it grows from the ground with new sprouts, that initial stalk from last year turned brown, died, fell back, and I cut it off because that's part of my variety's normal life cycle. And so as part of our spring cleanup in the garden, that's another topic that I had to talk about, but we're not going to be able to get into fully, is cleaning out the dead material in your garden, to prune those dead branches, to clean up the leaf piles, to clean up any old dead plants that are appearing. And you never know what they are. So I have I think it's a honeyberry bush. I have a honeyberry bush that last year was really struggling. It wasn't a happy plant. I was gonna dig it up last year, but like most gardeners, it's like, I'll give it one more year. And I look at it now, it didn't survive the winter. So that's a spring activity. I'm gonna dig up that old shrub and think about what I'm gonna put in its place. Maybe I'll put the new plant in this year. Maybe that's or this spring, maybe that's a fall project. I haven't figured that out yet, but that dead plant needs to go. Look throughout your garden. Anywhere that you've got dead plants, they're not doing any good in your garden for the most part. So get rid of them. I do have dead tree branches that I'm leaving because of what we talked about earlier. So I have a willow. Willows don't do great in my area. I didn't plant it. It came with the house. I keep waiting for it to die, and it keeps hanging on, but it has a lot of dead branches. I leave those dead branches for the birds so that the birds can perch, so they can be protected from predators. It's not pretty, but it serves a purpose. So unless you've got a dead plant that serves a purpose, get rid of it and put something in its place that's going to give you the satisfaction you want. That live plant that you can harvest for the fruit that it produces, or you can cut the flowers that it makes, or just sit back and enjoy because maybe it's attracting some beneficial insects. That's a good springtime activity, as well as fall. You should think about cleaning up your fall garden the same way for the same reasons, and just add that to your list. If you don't, I talked about the weeds earlier. If you don't take care of those perennial weeds in spring, if you don't clean up your garden in spring, by the time summer comes and you want to put the seeds and the plants in, you're playing catch up. Where you were going to put your plants, you might not be able to put your plants because the weeds have taken over, or because you got to still get rid of those dead plants. So do it during the early days before you have the big active activities happening in your garden, and then you can save time for those big activities that are coming. And that's how I like to spread out some of the things that I'm doing in my garden. Is I spread them out seasonally based on what the next season is going to bring. So a lot of my spring activities are really focused on summer. What do I need to do in the garden now to prepare my garden for the active growing season during the hot months? And if I can save a little time on a good warm day before my plants are in, it just means that I have more time on those hot days to focus on the plants that are actively growing. So many things you can do in spring, and so many things that actually get you outside in the garden. Now, I said this last week. I've said it in a few other forums, and then of course I said it at the beginning of the show today, but I'm not going to be here for the next couple of weeks. I'm actually going to be missing the next couple Mondays because I will be traveling. I will be back in 3 weeks on May 19th. So on May 19th, the Monday, we will do this all over again. And we will have a wonderful Monday. By then, hopefully, all of us are going to have some plants actively growing in the garden. We will have gotten out. We'll have taken care of a lot of these spring activities. So this is my homework for you. This is my challenge for you. Spend the next 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, actually. It'll be 3 weeks from today. So you spend the next 3 weeks getting your garden cleaned up, getting your planning for summer finalized if you haven't already done that yet. Do all the things we've been talking about over the course of the last hour and a half, so that when we start talking about the active growing season and the summer growing that we'll be talking about going into the end of May and June, you'll be all ready to go. And then, of course, the reason I encourage you to get out in your garden now, so you can have your questions ready when I get back to ask about the things that maybe you didn't ask about today. So yeah, there you go. Mobius is saying, put out your deck furniture. Absolutely. Yeah, I keep talking about getting out in your garden and sitting in the garden and enjoying the birds. Yeah, do that. I put my cushions out for my patio furniture. They're stored away in the winter because it doesn't do any good to have my cushions with all the snow on them. But yeah, I've put them out so I have a place to sit. And my gazebo furniture, it's all ready to go. We've already been sitting underneath it. So yes, that's a wonderful thing. So thank you to all of you who are saying to have a great trip, safe travels. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to try. So I'll be doing a lot on my phone, filming on my phone. I'm going to be doing some editing on my phone. Most of what I do, pretty much all of what I do in my videos, I do with a camera, and I do with editing software. So cross your fingers, wish me luck, but I'm going to try to shoot some footage and edit a video and get it all ready to go and then release it within the next couple of weeks from my phone. So if I don't have videos coming out of the next couple of weeks, it's because I'm still trying to figure out that whole process. But I think I'll be able to figure it out. I have helpers along the way that are really going to make a difference. And so look for new videos, but they're going to be from a different location. And it's going to be a different garden in a different country. And it's going to be a different format. And so those are coming. And stick around for the next couple of weeks to see what those are. The first one, I'm kind of excited about because I know where I'm going to be and I know what I'm going to film and I know what I want to do. So I'm hoping that's going to be the first one that's released later this week, maybe on Friday, maybe on Saturday. We'll see. But you can expect more to come, and I'll see you back here in 3 weeks. I hope you have a wonderful time. I will miss you. I'll miss my pups during the time that I'm gone. And so I hope that we can all get back together again as though it was just tomorrow. But there's a lot more stories that we'll be able to tell between now and then. So thank you for all of your support. Thank you for all you do to make this a wonderful community. And I look forward to being back and telling you about my wonderful travels. And it's going to be great. So get out there, get some good gardening done. And while you do it, of course, enjoy it. I'll see you later.